Hi, this is Volume 2 on the voice of Enrico Caruso. Um, I think a lot of you would like to know how these records were made. This is kind of hard to see, but Over There by Caruso. Great record. Interesting to hear. He sings it in English in his own special style. A lot of people refer to the recording as Over There, but he sang it fervently and strongly and very much supported the country he loved. But let's think for a second. How did they make those records? I have spent the last 35 years studying sound recording and the history of it. I've learned an awful lot, and I've decided that probably it makes sense to sit down and start sharing some of this. How would you make a record? Let's say 1918. We're going to make a record in the Victor studio. We're going to record over there, just as a for instance. Well, the first thing that had to be done is everyone had to get into the studio and play the recording through from positions they felt comfortable in, including the singer. Then they would take that wax recording and play it, therefore destroy it, and see what it sounded like. At that point, the director, the sound director, the recording engineer, they would all come in, and then they would sit there and move the orchestra around. The orchestra would be placed in various areas. Certain instruments caught on well with the wax. A lot of instruments didn't. Violins, such as Stroh violins, had to be used. I'll get into that later when we talk about those. But each person who's playing an instrument had to be played so it blended with the other instruments. This might take 4 or 5 takes of not the official takes. These are the basically setup takes. See, that's the one thing people don't realize. They look and they say, it was only one take in this recording. No. Those are for the finished recording. But when you were setting up the studio, it required take after take after take. It was extremely difficult work, extremely tiring work, exhausting for many singers and musicians. So finally, when they had put the flute over here and they put the tuba way back there and brought some trumpets over here and had the violin up against the horn, and they had the singer. The singer also had to do certain things. The singer just couldn't sing into the horn. That was a no-no. When you were singing in a regular volume, you could sing into the horn. But if you started singing loudly, you had to back up and look up. So the sound would not go crashing into the horn, and by doing so, blast. Blasting was one of the big problems with acoustic recording. And you always had to be careful not to blast. And so a singer was well trained when making records, that when they had a high note, they leaned back a little bit and would look up or look to the side. Just make sure they didn't fire with a full salvo at the recording horn with a high note. And it happens. For those who are familiar with these early recordings, sometimes you can hear ghost echoes of a high note coming. And you'll hear a few grooves before the high note comes. You can already hear little bits of it because they fired a direct salvo of voice at the recording horn. I interviewed Louise Homer's daughter many, many, many years ago. She was working for the Red Cross, as a matter of fact, at that time. And I asked her what it was like. Her mother must have told her, and she said her mother talked about it a lot. Louise Homer, the contralto. And she said when they recorded when they recorded the Rigoletto Quartet, the first time they did that in 1907, They had to move and jump out of the way. When they would sing, each would move a little closer to the recording horn. When the band would be playing, they would be leaning down so to let the sound go past them. When they were singing high, they were looking up, moving around, dancing around, just trying to make sure they didn't blast. Sounds like a very, very elaborate and confusing dance. But this is what had to be done. As I told you in the first video, there was no mixers, no channels, no electricity. It was purely acoustic. And the thing is that by being purely acoustic and no electricity, the only way you can mix instruments is to physically mix them. And you have to move them around till they blend. A lot of work, a lot of exhausting work. There's a recording of Caruso making a record, and it took 6 tries to finally get it right. And it was a trumpet player playing with him. And the trumpet player was beet red. And Caruso took his stick pin out and handed it to the trumpet player, saying, "You merit reward." He said, "I wasn't sure which one of us was going to burst first." And that was typical of Caruso. A lot of times Caruso would come into the studio to do this work, which was very grueling, and it would get hot. There's no air conditioning in those days. And so off would come the collar, and he'd open his shirt and probably be sweating profusely, especially in the summer. And they would make these recordings under very, very controlled circumstances. Now, one of the things that you have to remember about these recording studios that we don't talk about is the fact that how did you focus the sound into that recording horn? Well, the walls were wood. They were polished woods. And you may ask, why polished woods? Well, it would reflect sound. And it would take all of that bright sound and focus it right into the recording horn. You see, that's the one thing that Victor did. If you listen to a Victor record, it has a very, very powerful, almost buzz-like sound. In operatic singing, there is a term called squilla. If you translate it, it means the squeal of a pig. But in singing, you create that wah, 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 wah sound. And that's what they were trying to do with the Victor records. They were trying to capture that sound. And so that's what was going on in each and every one of these recordings. Now, once you got the whole orchestra set up and the singer set up, and you tape all the spots on the floor so where to be, a lot of times you go for lunch. Or you would sit there and make a recording. A lot of times they'd have to do it again and again. Sometimes the singer would have a little mess up in the voice, or a trumpet would squeak, or a violinist would be off key. A myriad of things would go on. What you have to remember about these recordings, that's the most important thing of all, is they had to go from beginning to end without making a mistake. That's remarkable. It would be almost impossible today. Because you know something? When you listen to a recording today, you're not listening to a performance usually. You're listening to a created performance that takes the best of several recordings, puts them together, and creates a performance that would be almost physically impossible. But in these early recordings, like Caruso, they did it. Did it hundreds of times.